it begins with Virgil revealing the theme, how Aeneas will come to found the city that will become Rome. He tells that Aeneas is not, of course, not going to have an easy time of it, because it wouldn't be exactly be much of an epic if he just went there and founded the city. It revealed that the main source of his hardships is the goddess Juno, hateful of the Trojans because of Paris choosing Venus over her in the beauty contest. Venus, who also happens to be Aeneas' own mother. Juno is also against Aeneas because she loves the city of Carthage, which she knows will be destroyed by Romans. The first scene shown is Aeneas and his ship sailing past Sicily. Juno sees this and not only angry at the Trojans and Aeneas, but the fates themselves who are not letting her have her way. She goes to Aeolus, the king of winds, to try to stop Aeneas. She bribes him with an offer of marriage to her most beautiful nymph, if he does as she asked, as she does not actually have any power over him. He does, however, do as she asks and releases the winds from the mountain that traps them. The winds create a terrible storm which wrecked 3 of the Trojan ships and trapped 3 more on sandbars. Aeneas yells of how he wished he could have died defending Troy rather than like this. Neptune, however, feels the oceans being stirred by the storm, and when he comes to check, he is not happy with what he sees. He tells off the winds for stirring up his oceans without his permission, and before he's even finished speaking, the storm has stopped. Neptune helps the stuck ships back into the seas and leaves, as do the Trojans. They find a natural harbor in North Africa, surrounded by high cliffs, and disembark. Aeneas and Achates survey the sea from a hill, hoping to see some sign of their lost ships, but find nothing. Until Aeneas does see a herd of deer and kills 7 of them, 1 for each of his ships. When he returns, he puts on a brave act, telling his men not to despair, that one day they will look back on these hardships proudly. But inside, Aeneas is feeling worse than his lost comrades than the others. Jupiter is watching the Trojans that night, and Venus comes and complains about her son's hardships. When other survivors of Troy, like Antenor, have already begun settling in different parts of Italy, Jupiter explains to her what would happen. He will let Aeneas reach Italy, where he will fight a war with a tribe called the Rutulians. After this, he will reign for 3 years, and then his son Ascanius will rule for 30 in Alba Longa, where the Trojans will live for 3 more centuries until Ilia, their queen and priestess, will bear a child by the god of war Mars and give birth to Romulus and Remus. Romulus, of course, will found Rome. The next day, Aeneas and Achates are through the woods and happen across Venus disguised as a huntress. Aeneas is smart enough to realize that she is a goddess, but can't figure out which one. Aeneas, maintaining her act, tells Aeneas about Dido, the queen of Carthage, that she once lived in the city of Tyre, how her husband was the wealthy Sychaeus and her brother was Pygmalion the king. She tells him of how Pygmalion murdered Sychaeus for his money and even managed to keep it a secret from Dido, until Sychaeus' ghost appeared in Dido's dreams to reveal what happened, telling her to flee the city as well as where his treasures was. Dido gathered some people and sailed, heading west and landing in northern Africa, where they founded what is now the city of Carthage they are currently building up. It was not until Venus is already leaving that Aeneas recognizes her, complaining of how she always does this and never simply comes out and speaks to him. Before she leaves, Venus wraps Aeneas and Achates in a pillar of mist so they can enter and survey Carthage unseen. In the city, Aeneas sees a temple of Juno being built, and he and Achates approach it. They see the door depicts several scenes of the Trojan War, many of which came from scenes of the Iliad. Then Dido arrives and takes a seat in Juno's shrine. A group of Trojans, the very ones Aeneas thought lost, show up and tell Dido of who they are and how they came here. And they also come to complain of how the locals have treated them. They ask for permission to stay long enough to prepare their ships, and they will either sail for Italy if they can find Aeneas, or head for Sicily, where Kestis, a Trojan, now set himself up as a king. Dido apologizes, saying that she has heard of Aeneas, and gives them permission to stay, and even offers to send out search parties to try and find Aeneas. It is then that the mist of Venus shrouded Aeneas and Achates and dissipates. Aeneas thanks Dido for helping, and Dido tells him too that she has lost her home in Tyre. Dido brings them to the palace and arranges a feast, while Aeneas sends Achates back to camp to get Ascanius and presents for Dido. At this point, Venus intervenes, disguising Cupid as Ascanius and hiding the real Ascanius away. In his guise, the god of love inflames Dido with a love for the Trojan leader. As the feast continues, Dido asks Aeneas of what happened at Troy and how he came here. Aeneas begins to tell her story, and thus begins Book 2. The story of, in respect to the rest of the story, Book 1 begins in the middle of things. Rather than start at the beginning, Aeneas has already left Troy and gotten packed, and has already begun wandering afterwards. It is not until he has already arrived in Carthage that the story of Books 2 and 3 are the beginning. One of the articles I found was by Peter Knox, a rather short article that points out where Virgil has gotten several plot points in Book 1 from. For example, Aeneas and Achates being hidden in mist, and Dido's love for Aeneas. The mist itself has as Knox says, has two precedents. One in the story of Jason, who with his crew approached the palace of Aeetes under the cover of a cloud. The other in the Odyssey, where Odysseus suddenly emerges from a cloud to the stunned silence of the Phaeacians. In regard to Dido's love, Medea's love for Jason had very similar circumstances. Specifically, she is shown to like Jason right away, and later Eros pushes that along, as Cupid does to Dido at the feet of Venus. Though Dido is shown to have, as Dido is also shown to have feelings for Aeneas before any godly intervention. This is observant, as Dido is shown to be impressed to be impressed with Aeneas before he reveals himself. She immediately offers to send search parties out to find him, and though she was willing to help the Trojans before, she immediately offers a feast as soon as once Aeneas has arrived. Another article by Betty Kuiper is a very shorter article about a particular comparison Virgil does comparing Aeneas and Dido to Apollo and Diana. She suggests that the comparison does not just refer to their close relationship, but that they have a relationship similar to brother and sister. Adding to her own statement, she states that if this is the case, then it might be a comparison to incest, where their love cannot really be a true marriage, and thus, of course, cannot work as Juno wants it to. But if this is too much, she says, then it can be a foreshadowing, and compares Rome and Carthage's later war to a sibling rivalry of the bitterest kind. This article is very short, only a few paragraphs, and she makes a very simple point. Juno tries to defy the fates by attempting a marriage that even she really knows won't work. And as for the sibling rivalry, this is very apt, because Dido and Aeneas' relationship is before either city has truly gotten onto its feet. And when Rome wars with Carthage and destroys it, even going so far as to salt the land. Another article, ironically written by two people both named Eliot. But they refer to a section of them that they see as mistranslated, that they see as often mistranslated simply because authors do not usually recognize that there could be a double meaning to the words. The words that when Aeneas is speaking to his crew before they found Carthage, that they shall look back on these things that they shall remember these things with pleasure, and that is wrong in the reference that they believe Virgil meant. They say that rather than actual pleasure at looking back on the hardships, the meaning is that there is value in the experience of the hardships, and that the experience can help them in the future, or even the future generations can find some resolve in their trials. I agree with this, as the literal translation doesn't truly make sense. It's possible. It doesn't make sense that they can find pleasure in having to flee their home as it burns, or nearly die in the storm. But it does make sense they can find some resolve in the trials as they look back. The last article I found is about the irony in the Aeneid, specifically the point at when Aeneas speaks to speaks to Venus in her guise as a huntress. Aeneas can immediately recognize that she is a goddess, but yet cannot realize does not realize who she is. And when Venus asks him to tell her about what has happened to him, he does, and several times refers to things Venus herself has done, and still does not realize who she is. But there's not only that irony, but a bit more below the surface, that Aeneas is also always a step behind the gods, something reinforced numerous times. This is simply true. There is a simple irony of him speaking to his own mother and not realizing it. He, despite realizing she is a goddess, and he himself says just before she leaves, that she does not appear to him directly, and often does things like this. He does not realize it was her. And there's also of Aeneas being behind the gods each time is true. Despite there being the aspect of his loyalty, it was also the irony that it was the pettiness of the gods, specifically Venus being one of the main causes that caused him to his home that caused his home to be destroyed, as well as the death of his wife. And as he said before, if he had a choice, he really would have stayed in Troy, or later possibly stayed at Carthage, if not for the intervention of the gods. And that's it.
Well, to te omnes, first of all. Oh, stay up there, John. Stay up there, John. Some big things you brought out. That was very, very good. The articles you found. Certainly the parallels with Jason and Medea, and the notion that while certainly Virgil does some original things, this isn't out of nowhere. This is out of a tradition, both Homeric and epic. So you should see parallels there. I like that. We know the Jason and Medea story, if you remember back to second year. I certainly think that's an interesting parallel there. You certainly see the crazed reaction of Medea, which results in murder. Here, Dido's results in suicide. So I think that's all very good stuff. I think that Apollo and Diana business is absolute nonsense. To see that as a parallel of Apollo and Diana and possibly incest, are you out of your ever-loving mind? It makes no sense.
Was that more metaphorical? That like she says that an incest she doesn't believe can result in a real marriage, and it's like this with Juno attempting to marry them.
Yeah, no, that's dumb. I disagree with that entirely.
Says it might go too far.
Okay, and I heard you. Yeah, I heard you get that in there, and I thought that was great that she acknowledged that her own argument might be ridiculous. Yeah, it foreshadows Rome and Carthage, but if you're going to use a family metaphor, how about divorce? Rome and Carthage are the children of divorce, and they are bitter against each other. That makes way more sense than.
The article was also very short. It's literally.
What year was that? Do you know?
The article?
Yeah.
Which one is it?
Because that's short. My hunch is it was probably pretty old. But then again, I don't know.
Here, one of these.
Probably got in your bibliography.
Kind of like incest.
Well, at any rate, the Uwabit, so they will help to remember these things. Absolutely right. You were totally right to agree with that, John. Clearly, it's about the benefit of the experience, not the pleasure in remembering. I thought you were right on there.
Were we supposed to attach our articles?
No, you
I
didn't.
did to mine, but.
And the whole notion of Aeneas always being a step behind the gods, I think we've definitely seen that and are seeing that. I thought that was very, very good stuff. Okay, thank you, John. Next up, Dr. Logan. Try to say Dr. Hogan.
Dr. Hogan.
Dr. Harkus Hogan.
More like Mrs. Logan.
Oh.
Gender swap. Wow.
Okay.
That wasn't even good because that's not the. Okay.
So, in Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas recounts the tale of Troy's fall. After the Greeks realized they were unable to defeat the Trojans in battle, they sailed from the shores. They left behind a massive wooden horse filled with Greek warriors, although the Trojans weren't aware of the ruse yet. Additionally, they were unaware the Greeks actually hid their fleet behind the island of Tenedos near the coast, an island Aeneas describes as Nuc Tantum Sinus et Statio Malefida Carinis, or badly loyal to ships. The Trojans emerge from the city in awe at the sight of the horse. They begin to debate whether or not to destroy the contraption or take it inside the walls with them. Laocoon, a priest, runs from the city to examine the horse. He warns against trusting anything from the Greeks, giving us the phrase "Don't trust a Greek bearing gifts," and even raises a supposition that there are Greeks hiding within. He throws a spear at the belly, causing an echo to sound within. Unfortunately for them, the Trojans fail to realize this sign of treachery, something Aeneas comments upon later. Et si fata deum si mens non laeva fuisit impuleret ferro argo licas foedari latebras tro haque nunc staret priamique arx alta maneris. If the fates of the gods, if their minds had not been so treacherous, he would have driven us to spoil the Greek hiding place with swords, and Troy would now stand, and you, high citadel of Priam, you would remain. Suddenly, before the Trojans can make a decision, there is a commotion. A group of shepherds come forward with a Grecian prisoner. His name is Sinon, and begins to tell them his story, a work of crafty deceit. Sinon claims that he is related to Palamedes, a hero from the Trojan War opposed to the fighting. Ulysses, annoyed with Palamedes' stance on the war, used trickery to lead to Palamedes' execution on a false charge. Sinon spoke out against this, and because of this, Ulysses was out to get him. Sinon also claims that the Greeks attempted to sail home many times, but were hindered by bad weather, and that their problems only worsened after the horse was built. A man was sent to find out the will of the gods, and they learned that a human sacrifice was needed. It was decided that Sinon would be sacrificed, but he escaped, and the Greeks sailed away. Sinon begs for his life and swears no allegiance to the Greeks. The Trojans feel pity for him and take him in. They proceed to inquire about the horse, to which he replies that after Ulysses and Diomedes stole a statue of Minerva from the Trojan citadel, extraordinary events began to take place that spelled ill will for the Greeks. The same seer that determined Sinon was to be the sacrifice determined that these events meant that Troy was impossible to capture, and deemed that they needed to create a replacement for the stolen statue. Sinon convinced the Trojans that leaving the horse on the beach would destroy Troy, and taking it in would destroy the Greeks. Meanwhile, Laocoon prepares to make a sacrifice to Neptune, when suddenly, Ecce autem gemini tenedos tranquilla per alta, Horesco referens, immensis oribus anguis incumbent quagi pariatique ad litora tendunt. Two twin snakes with red crest emerge from the sea near Tenedos and devour Laocoon and his sons. The Trojans interpret this as a punishment for attacking the horse and decide to bring it into the city. Celebrations commence as they roll the wooden beast into the city, all the while the Trojans blissfully unaware of the ominous signs that the horse is in fact a key to their impending doom. After a night of partying, the entire city sleeps. Sinon lets the Greeks out, and they dispatch the sentries, opening the gates to the Greek army which has returned to the shores. In his dream, Aeneas sees Hector, covered in blood, and appearing as he did when Achilles was defiling his body. Hector warns Aeneas that Troy is about to be captured, and that Aeneas must gather his belongings and household gods and found a new city. Aeneas awakens to a city in peril. He immediately prepares for battle. Even though he is told that the city is doomed, he is ready for fighting after meeting with some companions. They charge into the night, kill some Greeks, and don their armor to disguise themselves as they continue to hunt more invaders. Eventually, they reach Priam's palace, where Priam and his son are brutally murdered by Neoptolemus. This causes Aeneas to think of his own father, so he promptly heads home. On the way home, Aeneas sees Helen trying to hide. He is prepared to murder her on the spot, but when his mother Venus appears and directs the blame of Troy's fall from Helen to the will of the gods themselves, Aeneas changes his mind and continues. Once at home, after convincing his father to leave, Aeneas, his father, wife, and child head out into the burning city to meet at a tree outside so they can run to the hills. Along the way, he is separated from his wife Creusa, but on returning into the burning city looking for her, he encounters her ghost. The ghost of Creusa urges him to continue to Italy where the Tiber River flows, where he was to get a new kingdom and wife. Aeneas loyally accepts, and after grouping up with additional refugees, the group sets out on their voyage. This is part 2. So book 2 is the first of 2 books which give background on Aeneas' travels thus far. Virgil uses this book to describe Aeneas as a hero through his actions and reflections on the events that transpired during the fall of Troy. Even before he begins telling the story, Aeneas displays his still present, deep emotional connection to the horrors he witnessed. when he says, Infandum regina, Jubes renovare dolorum trojanas ut opes et lamentabile regnum erunt Danae quaque ipse miserema vidi et quorum pars magna fui. Unspeakable, O Queen, the things that you order me to renew, things which I myself saw, the wretched of which I was a large part, how the Greeks overthrew Troy's wealth and woeful realm. Virgil connects Aeneas' pain to the story at hand immediately, setting an air of remorse over the whole story, visible when Aeneas questions the inability of himself and his people to notice their impending doom. These quips appear in various places, such as his remarks on Laocoon's correct prediction, et si fatum deum si mens non laeva fuset impu lera ferro argo licas foedare ladabras to troaque nunc stare priamque arx alta maneres. If the fate of the gods, if their mind had not been so treacherous, he would have driven us to spoil the Greek hiding place with swords, and Troy would now stand, and you, high citadel of Priam, you would remain. Another such remark is found when the Trojans are bringing the horse into the city, and 4 times the clash of the armor of the Greeks inside could be heard, but was ignored. O patria, O divum domus illum et incluta bello moena Dardania, quater ipso in limine portae subsidi aquae utero senitum quater arma dedere. In both these comments, Aeneas speaks with a tone of regret and sadness, revealing a loyal, pious character, something Virgil portrays throughout the Aeneid. One great example of Aeneas' dedication is demonstrated in his utter lack of hesitation to muster the will to fight when he awakens to his city on fire and under attack, as seen in lines 316 to 317, when he says, Cur iraque mentum praecipitat, pulchrumque mori securit in armis. Or, frenzy and anger drive my soul headlong, and I think how glorious it is to die in arms. Without consideration of himself, he is instantly ready to go on a final suicidal rampage for his city, truly a sign of devotion. Finally, not only does Virgil use Book 2 to portray Aeneas as a passionate, loyal, and committed individual to his city, he also connects Aeneas' loyalty to the gods as well. In the Helen scene, Aeneas is completely ready to tear her head off, this woman he views as the root of the problems that now face the city. It would be loyal to his city, even, to enact a sort of mutual revenge upon her right when he sees the opportunity. Instead, he listens to Venus and continues on to save his family instead of taking his frustrations out on Helen. So this is part 3 and 4 together. The Helen scene has for centuries confounded scholars in relation to its authenticity. The 2 following reports deal with the possibly spurious Helen episode. In the Helen episode in Virgil's Aeneid 2, 559 to 623, H.R. Fairclough discusses the validity of the scene and synthesizes different viewpoints presented by previous authors. After much debate and considerations for both sides, Fairclough finishes by agreeing with Richard Heinz's belief that the passage is indeed spurious and has taken the place of an actual Virgilian passage that was omitted in the originally published manuscripts. Fairclough agrees that instead of considering to kill Helen, Aeneas actually considered to kill his own suicide, to which Venus persuaded him otherwise. Victor A. Estevas in Aeneid 2, 624 to 631, and the Helen and Venus episode, also compiles various arguments for or against labeling the episode as spurious. Estevas, however, unlike Fairclough, refuses to take a stance on the issue. Instead, he appropriately frames the controversy as up to the reader to decide whether or not they will accept the passage or not. He claims it is up to the reader to determine the manner in which they want to view the hero. With the current information available, it is impossible to know in certainty whether or not the passage is authentic, which is why both reports are very helpful in framing the issue. The authenticity of the scene and the implication of the validity of the scene on the Aeneid as a whole are up to the reader. Scholars can debate the Helen episode, but unless you actually become a full-fledged researcher and gather evidence from primary sources and analyze the work of secondary sources, all you can do is merely choose a side. Fairclough and Heinz decided to put the effort into researching the issue and reach a similar conclusion, one I partly agree with, but in no way can it be proven, only substantiated. This side picking is exactly what Estevez covers. In choosing to view the passage in whichever manner you will, without attempting an undertaking to determine hard data on the subject, is essentially picking the version that you think sounds better to you. This comes down to a reflection of what you believe about Aeneas and the Aeneid as a whole, even worldviews on whether it is right for a man to feel this way about a woman, as Fairclough discusses, and has less to do with Virgil's intention rather than the reader's beliefs.
Plenty omnes. You made one very good comment there, the notion that, and I think it was coming from you, not from another scholar or anything, but I think you said, that it would be really loyal to his city to get revenge on her. I just encourage you to remember that the week after Thanksgiving when we get into this Helen thing more seriously. Well done. Let's have Caitlin to the stand, please. Okay.
Oh, I redid my thing.
Okay.
Can I give it to you tomorrow?
Okay, book 3, here we go.
Third book of the Aeneid begins with the departure of Aeneas and his followers from their fallen homeland, setting out in search of a land in which to found a new Troy. It passes in a string of landings in various different places, episodes of greater or lesser significance, generally involving divine interference.
I'm going to pause you right there. This one, because we have kind of glanced at it in English and did not read it, you definitely want to pay attention to her summary of this. Okay? So this is going to serve everybody very, very well. Please continue.
And the travelers' subsequent departure from each stop. First the Aeneadae land in Thrace and found a city, but are frightened away by a man half killed by broken hospitality. They stop briefly at Delos to make sacrifices and sail on to Crete. Here they suffer a terrible plague, which alerts them to the fact that this is not the land destined for their settlement. They are tormented by the Harpies in the Strophidae, stop to worship at Actium, and enjoy the hospitality and the foreknowledge of fellow Trojan refugees at the small Troy of Euthrota. Upon their departure from this second Troy, at the urging of the seer Helenus, they sail to Italy, daring to pass between Scylla and Priscilla. Then they make landfall on the island of the Cyclops, only to flee at the urging of one of Odysseus' own men. The book ends with the traumatic death of Aeneas' father Anchises and an interval of rest. Book 3 serves as the second half of Aeneas' narrative to Dido of his wanderings and trials. It describes in a rather perfunctory way the various episodes of the Odyssean journey of Aeneas and his men across the Mediterranean, skimming over them more quickly than the other happenings of the poem. It also accents the rootlessness and desperation of the Trojans in their efforts to find a new homeland suitable for settlement. One of the more substantial patterns of this book is that of divine revelations, oracles, and signs, which occur at almost every stop and reveal to the Trojans increasing amounts about their destiny in Italy. It is, however, interesting which prophecies Aeneas chooses to follow, and the way they proceed from general and easily misinterpreted predictions to more thorough stories of the glorious future the Aeneadae have in store. When Aeneas departs from ruined Troy, he has heard only what the ghost of Hector and the spectre of his wife Creus had told him, that he must bear his household gods out into the world in order to found a new Troy. The advice of these visions, however, appears to have been forgotten or disregarded as from untrustworthy sources, and so he begins his travels with as little knowledge of the future as a man who had not seen such signs. The greater sequence of his revelations begins in Thrace, then, with a vague and simple warning to flee, given them by Polydorus, a half-dead messenger suffering due to the betrayal of hospitality. Gradually, the prophecies grow more and more detailed. The Delian oracle of Apollo advises them to seek their ancient motherland, an unfortunate phrasing misinterpreted even by wise Anchises. And the Penates on Crete give the land the Trojans seek a name, Hesperia. The Harpy tells a fuller version of the future, that the travelers will be so hungry and full of suffering that they will eat their tables. The arc culminates in Helenus' elaborate story of how they will reach Italy and what glory is in store for there for their descendants. The remaining visions reflect the first few, trailing off once again into mere omens, the 4 white horses, and Achaemenides' warning to flee, which strongly parallels Polydorus's in both its content and its urgency. This stylistic arc of revelations, however, is also influenced by a larger trend, in which Aeneas begins to interpret divine advice more readily and his understandings become more accurate. These are tied together because Aeneas never shows the slightest hesitation about doing God's will once it seems to be understood. He simply must learn to completely understand and trust each vision before he feels comfortable following its directions. In this way, the third book shows Aeneas growing more skilled at comprehending and correctly obeying the will of the gods, gaining confidence and becoming very gradually more capable in his piety over time, aided by the imperfect but more experienced counsel of his father. Despite this increase in competence, however, he does seem to depend overmuch on Anchises' advice. An illustration of this is the fact that as soon as his father is no longer there to interpret for him, Aeneas gets into trouble. The episode with Dido obviously at odds with his destiny. This may be considered merely an appropriate obedience, a pious son yielding to his wise and more experienced ancestor. But though he is ostensibly the leader of his men, Aeneas cannot deal with the advice of the deities unless it is spoken very plainly. This weakness is perhaps even more striking because he is, in fact, the son of the goddess. It must be, therefore, either arrogance or ignorance which causes him to require the actual presence of the divine being to cause him to act without his father's agreement. Both in the night of Troy's fall and at Carthage, Aeneas wanders aimlessly until a god comes along to supply him with initiative. The troublesome nature of Aeneas' dependence on his father for clarity touches on another overarching theme, the importance of distancing oneself from the past. In Book 2 of the Aeneid, Anchises is seen as an inert burden which Aeneas must carry bodily from the burning ruin of Troy. Throughout Book 3, Anchises seems to regain much of his missing strength in order to aid his son in leading his countrymen, and especially in comprehending the messages of the gods which it is Aeneas' duty to follow. This is a very important part to play, and Anchises helps keep Aeneas grounded in numerous ways, as all good memories do. However, he also stymies Aeneas' own growth by performing for him the vitally important role of dealing with the gods. At first, when he no longer has Anchises' guidance, Aeneas is lost and has difficulty knowing what to do or even how to continue with his quest. Here I, who had weathered so many storms at sea, lost my father, Anchises, solace of all my cares. Best of fathers, rescued from such great perils, in vain you abandoned me in my weary hour. It is necessary that Aeneas truly move on beyond this loss in order to grow into his role as leader of the Trojans, a position of which emissary to the gods is an important part. Only once he has been parted from his past is Aeneas able to progress, emphasized by the aid which the no longer corporeal Anchises gives Aeneas as his own personal vision and as a shade. Aeneas is then able to understand and follow the gods' will in his own right. Robert B. Lloyd's exhaustive study of Book 3 was certainly the most helpful of the small number of articles I was able to find. It describes the charges of inferiority leveled against the book, and then addresses them by describing in detail the deliberate patterns of the episodes and the revelations they contain, as well as elaborating upon the themes these revelations serve to address. At first rather grim about the prospects of my exceedingly dull book, this article convinced me that Book 3 was just as great and rich in meaning as the other sections of the epic. E. Adelaide Hahn's more specific study of visions in this book and the previous one was also helpful and introduced me to the idea on which I more or less centered my own paper. She describes a number of visions and explains Aeneas' thoughts dictating whether or not he would heed the prophecy, meanwhile defending the integrity of the book almost as skillfully as Lloyd does. David Quint's writings, however, did not seem quite as sound as the others, for he seems to be making too much of a theme which, while certainly present, is not as important as he supposed it to be. He describes the relationship between Anchises and Aeneas as one of rivalry, perhaps too harsh a word, and uses this and other events as metaphors for the larger theme of the importance of forgetting, and the ways that memory, while pleasant, can be more akin to a life of death than to reliving the past. He then speaks at length on how this theme serves as effective Augustan propaganda, which, while insightful, was unnecessary to the more limited scope in which I am writing. Overall, his article seems to be something of a stretch, and even if it is completely accurate, which it may be, I'm sure he's much more qualified to judge than I am, the insights it contained were excessive for the research topic on which I have tried to focus my efforts.
A lot of tail mix. couple of things there we've touched on before. I certainly don't want to get into any more of this today, but the notion of whether this is Augustan propaganda, the whole book, all that kind of stuff. What you ended up doing with that, and I don't know how much you guys really picked up from this. I'm tempted to Xerox perhaps Caitlin's paper and just pass it out to you. A lot of people don't like this any more than they like Led Zeppelin 3 for whatever reason. The third seems not to work.
Not a good album.
It doesn't work. But you, perhaps guided by the article, but you really found the key stuff there in what this book is doing. In terms, you talked about Aeneas having to deal with some things with the past before he could move on. His inability to interpret the gods, needing or not needing some sort of interpreter there, some intermediary. That was brilliant stuff. That was good stuff, and you really got a lot out of that book. I'm very, very pleased with that. Okay, book 4, Dr. Jenkins. Well done. Dr. Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins, I am going to simply suggest that this time, guys, because we are in it, and also because I don't want to totally tip, I mean, we know what's going to happen, but I also don't want to totally tip the hat there, or tip the hand there on what's coming up. Let's skip the summary, at least on your book. I'm only going to do that on probably yours, just because we're in it. So move to your scope and sequence and then the analysis stuff.
Okay. So in analyzing Book 4 with the entirety of Virgil's epic, it is clear that the book both establishes and expands on pivotal themes of the Aeneid. Aeneas' character as a hero is greatly strengthened in this book, as the audience is presented with an example of Aeneas' ability to rise above temptation to fulfill his duty. He understands that fate and the will of the gods must take priority over his own passions and desires. Book 4 is also the first instance in which the reader is fully exposed to Virgil's preference of reason and civic responsibility over emotion and desire. Dido's passion led her to commit suicide. On the other hand, Aeneas' loyalty and perseverance allows him to eventually found a great city. In addition, this book continues to present the immense power in divine intervention and its supremacy over free will. Within Book 4, there are many critical and decisive scenes in which Virgil's elaborate and perplexing